Welcome to the webinar today. My name is Mike Harrington with i.t.NOW. I'm going to be the host and presenter today, so we're excited to have you guys with us. Thanks for joining us. I have on the line as well Danny DeVries, who is our marketing manager here at i.t.NOW. And today, I'm going to give a brief introduction. We'll hop into our topic, which is cloud readiness for businesses, specifically SMB mid-market companies. It's been one that's come up a little bit lately, and I think there's reasons for that. We'll dive into that. Brief introduction before we get into that. So my name is Mike Harrington. I've been working here at i.t.NOW for the last 14 years, and I've been in the IT services space for the last 16 at this point, where my main job is actually just to help companies decide on what technology to use to push their business forward and get them the right support and security they need to build and maintain secure platforms they can successfully run and grow their businesses on. And so I spend my days consulting with companies around their IT stack, what they're currently doing for support, their cybersecurity solutions, and things like cloud to talk about how we can either get them to a better state. Usually it's get them to a better state in some way or another. That's why people call us most of the time, because something's broken and they need help. Sometimes because they just don't want to be an IT guy. And that's kind of what we do here at i.t.NOW, is fill some of those gaps for folks. That's been my role for the last long time. I love what I do. It's fulfilling to me to see our clients grow and expand using technology, and it's a fantastic thing. And I've seen a lot of it over the years. We have clients that started with us where they had 10 employees when they signed on with i.t.NOW, and they now have 2,000 employees years later. So it's exciting to see that kind of growth with our clients. And if we can enable it at all with the right technology, solution support, security, that's what we want to do here at i.t.NOW. Diving into our topic today, happy to have a discussion. If you guys have questions, feel free to shout them out or throw questions in chat, raise a hand, and we can talk through whatever is helpful to you guys. The content that we've put together today is really around cloud readiness, and the discussion has come up a few times. And this may seem like we're a little late to the party. A lot of businesses have already made the transition to the cloud, and that's true. A lot have. But what I've seen is in this last year, there's been a resurgence of companies who maybe a few years back, when we were looking at making a jump to the cloud, things weren't quite ready, or the apps that they use for their business weren't in a great cloud state at that point. They didn't have the options they need, that it made sense to make that jump for their business. And as a result, they didn't at the time, kept servers on-prem, and now we're 5, 6, 7 years later from that, and those servers are going end of life. And so now business owners are faced with a decision, hey, do we renew this equipment that we have that's been in-house, or is it now time to make the jump to the cloud? We've gotten everything out of our investment, and it's really good timing to take a look and say, hey, does it make sense to try to get rid of these servers in-house and just go completely cloud-based for our needs? So that's a little bit what we wanted to dig into today, talk through some definitions around that and some things that way that we hope are helpful information, with really the idea of trying to get to the root of what are the factors that we look for to figure out what the best cloud solution is for somebody. And there's a lot of variety to the cloud too. So we also want to talk about some of the different options you have for your business and what you guys can look at to move your applications, data, processes to the cloud to really enable your business. So we'll talk through a bunch of those things. This is the agenda today. So some definitions around the cloud, a little bit of context there, and maybe the different types of solutions, outlining how they're different, what the benefits of each is, and the situations where they might be most useful to you. And then talk a little bit about whether the cloud might be a good fit for your business. Can we get rid of all the servers in our office? Is that a possibility for us? Is the cloud secure, compliant? We can talk about security in the cloud a little bit. And even a kind of brief cost comparison of cloud versus on-premise with some factors to consider there. So that's what I wanted to jump into a little bit today. In simplest terms, the cloud is really just keeping your stuff on somebody else's server, right? So a lot of businesses will have servers, we call it on-prem, on their premises in their building where they're storing their data. When we talk about going cloud in one way or another, we're simply taking that server that you have there in the office and we're putting it in somebody else's location, typically in a virtualized way. We're not moving the physical hardware in most cases. There is some use cases where the physical hardware gets moved, but usually we're moving a virtualized server to somebody else's data center for them to take care of it for us, with a lot of advantages around that. And I think it's important to talk about maybe what a data center is as well as we're defining things here. These guys in the picture are in a data center. You have racks and racks of servers. They're set up in a giant building specifically made for that. Generally, it's set up with very specific ventilation, electricity, and internet in that location. So that you have redundancy on all of those items. So you have redundancy for heating, redundancy for cooling, redundancy for power, redundancy for internet, with the idea of making those workloads that you have for your server a lot more bulletproof than they would be if you were sitting in your office. Most of the time, if I see servers in a rack in somebody's office, and sometimes they're not even in a rack, they're just in a closet somewhere, a tower server. There isn't redundant heating, redundant cooling. There isn't a lot of security. Most data centers are going to have biometric security to get you into the building with very limited access on who they want in. Usually when I see servers in somebody's office, if we're lucky, they're behind a locked door in a closet somewhere. And so from both a physical security and your layers of security as far as firewalls and those things, data center holds a ton of advantages. It also holds a ton of advantages for uptime because of the redundant power, redundant internet, redundant heating, redundant cooling. A lot of data centers are even built on kind of earthquake-proof rockers, so that if there was some kind of major disaster, that's one of the biggest ones that we may have here in Salt Lake, would be an earthquake. They're built to essentially withstand those type of things. That's maybe a little bit about the cloud. We're keeping our server in somebody else's data center, usually, is what that means. A couple different things to talk about here. So we talk about on-premises servers, just means server in your office, physical server in your office somewhere. We talk about co-located. So this means that you take your physical server and then we're putting it in somebody else's data center, and we're essentially paying rent for that server in that space, right? So we're paying them to allow us to take our physical server, put it in their data center, and take advantage of that redundant heating, cooling, redundant internet, redundant power, all those things. A hosted server is where we take your data from your server and we virtualize it and we put it on somebody else's server at their physical location. So in that instance, you don't own any hardware. This is just your data in a virtual server on somebody else's equipment, and you're essentially paying rent for the equipment, the space that it takes up there in the data center. Web-based applications is another thing. So we talk about a lot of the servers that do exist on premise are application servers, where they're made to run a specific application or perform a specific task for a client. And those workloads more and more are being moved to web-based applications where you can access that app in a browser. And those web-based apps, essentially it's the same concept, right? So if somebody has servers for that app in their data center and they have everything set up so that they guarantee uptime and you pay a fee to be able to connect to that. And then they're the ones responsible for maintaining those servers, maintaining all the equipment, keeping everything up, guaranteeing uptime, so that application is available to you whenever you need it. Virtualization. This allows for multiple virtual servers, each running its own operating system and applications to run on a single physical server. So what we found over the years is that most servers the actual utilization of the hardware is very low. And to take advantage of that, software developers came up years ago. This is not really a new concept at all. It's been around forever, but the idea of taking that server operating system and virtualizing it so that we can run multiple virtual servers on one physical server. And this allows us to make better use of the hardware resources. And it also saves time and money because it detaches the software layer, your server layer, on that from the physical device in such a way that it makes it much easier if you ever do need to move to new hardware or back them up. Maintenance, a lot of the things become easier when you have a server in a virtualized environment. And then I've already talked about data centers, so I don't think I'm going to spend more time on that, but they're specifically built to house thousands of servers with redundant power, internet, cooling, etc. So a little bit about some of these definitions here. When you have a server on-prem, the advantages and disadvantages to it, right? So the advantage is that it's yours and you own everything about it and you have complete control over everything. The disadvantage is that it's yours and you own it and you have complete control over everything, which means that you're in charge of the hardware, the software, the network, utilities, security. And when I say utilities here, we're talking about power and internet and heating and cooling that you need to maintain that server operational. And maintenance, that's all your job if that server is on-prem. So you're on the hook to take care of all of it. I think the advantage for some people is that there's still some workloads that will work better on a local server. And it's few and far between at this point. We've come a long way with cloud solutions, but there are still a handful that there's some advantages to that way. I think there's also some certain types of compliance that require you to have complete control over everything and thus may require you to have on-premise servers. Again, that's pretty rare at this point. The majority of folks, the data centers have come a long way with building compliance systems that allow even people with complex compliance requirements to be able to move to the cloud successfully. That's a little bit about on-premise servers. When you have servers on-prem, you're in charge of everything. You need to update that hardware. Typically, the lifespan for a server is about 5 years, is what we see. They will run past that. Typically, we start to see the lower reliability and more problems, specifically with hard drives start failing, power supplies start failing, other things like that. So something to keep in mind when we're talking about on-premise servers, you are in charge of that hardware and everything it takes to maintain it. Co-located servers. So this is where you take your physical server and you put it in somebody else's data center. And typically this is to take advantage of the advantages of the data center that I mentioned, right? So better security, we got biometrics to get into the place, redundant heating, cooling, internet. And so if folks have found that their server has a workload that's critical to their business, and maybe their internet at the location where that server was hosted isn't the most reliable in the world, or they have frequent brownouts because of the power in that location. Co-location then becomes an attractive option where they can take their physical hardware that they've already invested in and simply locate it in a data center to gain those advantages of redundant power, internet, etc. That's usually why we see people use it. I feel like co-location has actually gone down significantly over the last few years as far as there's not as many use cases where it makes a ton of sense, just because more and more workloads have been transferred to a SaaS application or web-based apps, as well as full cloud solutions like Azure and some of the other big players out there in the space. Hosted servers. So this is where we essentially are renting space on somebody else's gear. i.t.NOW partners with Microsoft. Azure is typically what we use for a full hosted environment. And so this is where we take your server, we virtualize it on your physical server, and then we put it up in Microsoft's cloud. The advantages to that can be a bunch. You could see the cloud provider in that instance. If we're moving stuff to Azure, then Microsoft is the one responsible for taking care of that hardware. Microsoft is in charge of the software. Microsoft is in charge of the network, the power, the utilities, heating, cooling, and even part of the security for that device. Typically, you would still be in charge of maintaining your own servers in the cloud. So they give you the platform and all the goodies with it, but you still need to maintain your server to make sure that it's running properly and doing everything you need. Huge advantages to going hosted like this, mainly uptime. Most of these vendors, as far as like Amazon, Microsoft, a lot of the big cloud vendors will guarantee 99.99% uptime, which equates to just a few minutes a year that you would potentially have downtime during a scheduled outage. And so if you have sensitive workloads that really need to be maintained and available all the time, hosted servers can be a really attractive option for that. So something to think about there, how that who's responsible for everything. Hosted servers shifts some of that liability or risk from you internally to the provider themselves who's doing it. And then the last one here is web-based applications. So for web-based apps, you're essentially paying for access to this app. And a lot of times you can migrate your data into that app, and your data is sometimes yours and sometimes not. That's always a good question to ask when we're talking about SaaS applications. But it's important to understand that hardware, software, network, utility, security, maintenance, all on the people who are serving up that app. They're responsible for everything. And so you're essentially paying for 24/7 access to that application. And most of the SLAs you'll see, if you read through their agreement, it'll talk about how they guarantee that, right? How they're hosting that. It is important to look at your web-based applications when you sign up for them to make sure that they fit the bill, that they have the right security, that they have the redundancy and different things that you need. It's worth asking some questions around that. But most SaaS apps that are built by, I don't know, like reliable software vendors, are built securely and they're housed on redundant servers in data center that give you really a guarantee of uptime with them as well. And web-based applications is a great way to go because it really takes all the support and onus off of you and your team and puts it on the software vendor. And typically, monthly pricing for those apps really is going to work out in a way that's beneficial in a lot of cases as well. That's what we're looking at for web-based applications. So really all of that to say, hey, there's a lot of different ways to do this. We can put workloads up in the cloud in a bunch of different manners. What we've observed over the years is that a lot of businesses that have migrated, some of the most simple ones to migrate have already been moved, right? So things like email, a lot of folks have already moved to Gmail, Office 365, and email is up there and running, and we're happy and things are good with that piece. Very rare that I see anybody who has an on-premise email server at this point. But there's a lot of other workloads that weren't nearly as easy to move and haven't moved as quickly. Now in 2025, we have way more options than we ever did before for web-based applications, for hosting those servers, and even the more complex workloads. And a good example of that is we worked a few years ago with an engineering firm who does 3D AutoCAD design on various parts and equipment that they build for their clients and help design and build. And they wanted to virtualize that 3D CAD software in a way that their engineers could do it online. And this is at this point quite a while ago, probably 7 years ago. We were looking at virtualizing that workload for them and putting it up on the cloud. But the challenge we had was that in order to run the 3D design software that they had, they really needed that hosted server to have some pretty big, beefy GPUs, graphics cards in it. And at the time, there really weren't a lot of options like that available from a cloud provider or from most of the big public cloud providers. And so we ended up building one internally and built out a server with $6,000 graphics cards and then co-located it in a data center to give them the maximum uptime on it. And it was a pretty cool solution. that allowed them to have multiple people essentially remoted into a server, leveraging those graphics cards to do work on this application. But at the time, it was a pretty expensive undertaking, and it took a lot of time and effort to get set up. In 2025, Microsoft Azure and a bunch of the other major cloud providers, it's just an option in the drop-down menu. So when we're building out your hosted server, we can say, hey, we want this much, this many CPUs, we want this much RAM, we want a graphics card or don't. And you can select from a bunch of different graphics cards that you could have. So now it's a very simple thing where, not that long ago, this was complex and there was a lot of effort and cost into setting it up. So workloads have come a long way. There's a lot of things that we can do today that we weren't really able to do 7 to 10 years ago in the cloud, at least as cheaply as and as effectively as we do today. When we're looking at what matters as far as what do we need to look at when we're determining the best solution for somebody in the cloud? Because for most businesses, there are advantages to the cloud, but it's a question of which flavor, what solution is going to be the best for your particular business. So the key things we look at are these, right? What kind of apps do you guys use, right? Do we have applications like the one I just mentioned that uses graphics and has all these things that might complicate the scenario a little bit? Or are we using basic CRM and things like that are simple and easier to work with? Is there database back into those applications that you're using in your ERP system or whatever else? So looking at the type of software that we're working with and really what it connects to, right, is important to determining the best solution for you. We also look at how much data and what kind of data you have. So most data is going to move to the cloud just fine. There are some types of data, those 3D CAD drawings, things like that I just mentioned. You can move them to the cloud, and actually AutoCAD has come out with some new tech recently that makes that easier than ever was. But they don't live super well in a solution like SharePoint or some of your other Dropbox or file sharing applications that way. And that's something to understand and know what type of data we're talking about. And then how do users access it currently? Are users just in front of a desktop or a laptop when they're getting on this? Do we have folks who are out in the field who access an iPad or phone? And what is their kind of current path of entry to get into that? And how do we make it accessible and easy for anybody who does need it? Those are all things we think about along with security and regulatory requirements. Do you have any specific regulatory for HIPAA or PCI or CMMC or some other SOC 2 regulation that you guys have to follow for the security of your data so that we know how we need to secure it? At this point, all of those requirements can be met in the cloud. It's just a question of understanding those requirements so that we can get you the right solution when you do move. So finding apps a new home. So we look at a few different things here, and I'm going to take QuickBooks because it's a common application that a lot of businesses use, especially small and medium business, right? So if you're looking at QuickBooks, there is a web-based version of QuickBooks. And a lot of times if QuickBooks is what we're moving up to the cloud, we can just move it to the web-based version and it works just fine. However, the web-based version of QuickBooks is still a little limited. If you go to the desktop version of QuickBooks, there's a ton of different editions, and you have like Contractors Edition that has inventory modules and a bunch of other complexity with reporting and some of the things for accounting that does not currently exist in the web-based version of QuickBooks. And yes, QuickBooks can be moved to just a web-based app, but if you have a Contractors Edition or some other complex edition of QuickBooks, then it can't live on their web-based app. And so if you want to move that workload to the cloud, then we need to look at a different solution. And in the case of QuickBooks specifically, there's a company called Writeworks that actually just does QuickBooks hosting. And pretty inexpensively, they can host your version of the contractor's QuickBooks. And that might be a great solution for you. And we could also spin it up in Azure as a full hosted server and have you guys connect to that as well. So a few different ways to manage that. And most of our clients are looking for the easiest, least expensive path, right? And so if we can move you to the web-based application where all you have to do is pay $40 a month for the license and get on a web browser to look at QuickBooks whenever you need it, then that's probably the best place. If you use a version of QuickBooks that's not compatible with web-based version, then something like Right Networks hosting might be a really good fit for what you need and give you another inexpensive alternative and allow you to get to your full version of contractors QuickBooks that you need. So really, that's the process we go through when we're looking at this application. What does it need? Some apps will have a database backend, SQL, or another database on the backend. And so that has to be accounted for when you're moving them to the cloud as well. And so there can be some complexity there depending on the application. A lot of your typical ERP applications and others, like enterprise resource planning, that way businesses will have a database backend. And that just means that there's some additional planning that needs to happen when you move to the cloud. Some of those ERP apps will have a web-based version, and the software provider will maintain the database and everything else. So you can just pay for the web-based app, and that works fine. Some of those ERPs, they're not set up that way still. And so the option is to host that with a product like Azure. And then we end up spinning up an application server and another server to host that database, SQL, or whatever else it may be to get you the full functionality of that application. So those are the questions we ask. What does this app do? Who connects to it? What are we talking about? And how do we serve that up? So once we move that workload to the cloud and it's set up and running, people have access to it, how are they accessing that application? And what do we have to do to make sure that they can have the continued access? All things that we think about. So that's a little bit about moving apps to the cloud. And data is the same way. We ask a bunch of questions of how much data, how many files, who needs access to this. There's a lot of options for data file storage in the cloud now. A lot of our clients have gone to SharePoint. And if you have a business that doesn't have a super high complexity with software, ERP, or other things, SharePoint is a fantastic solution. And honestly, a lot of you are paying for it already. So if you have Office 365 licensing, you're likely already paying for SharePoint. And so it can be a great selection from that standpoint because it gives you easy access. It's web-based, it's secure, we can manage permissions on it. Allows you to put a bunch of your data up there in SharePoint and potentially get rid of a file server on-prem. And if you're already paying for the access to SharePoint with your Office 365 subscription, there's very little additional cost. So that's been a great option for a lot of our clients. If you have a lot more complexity or certain file types don't play as well in SharePoint, then something like Azure Files really becomes a great solution. And this essentially is doing what's boils down to a hosted file server in Azure for you, and then setting it up so you have access. So it looks like it's just like a server that's on premise. It's mapped the exactly same way. It shows up the same way. You can browse files the same way. Your files just aren't in your office. They're in the data center in Azure Files and being stored by Microsoft. And there's alternate solutions too, where people use Dropbox or 1 million other solutions to help share files throughout their companies. And so it's just a question of what's access do we need, who needs it, what type of files we're talking about, and we can help decide which is the best solution for your particular data set. User access is a big part of that. So what we've found is that cloud solutions have to make things easier and not harder for folks. So if we were able to just browse a share and get the files we need, now we have to do a whole thing where we remote into something and we have a VPN or all these complexity and connections. Sometimes it can hurt user adoption. And even worse, occasionally, if the solution is not, if it's so unfriendly to the user we occasionally will see them trying to get around this and put data other places. And that actually causes more problems than does good. And so I have to make sure that whatever we're picking, your users understand it. There's this moved cheese mentality, right? Hey, where's my stuff? We used to always be in this spot. Now where is it? We got to make it really simple for the user to know exactly where that data is, how to access it, and make their life easier with some of these moves that we're doing. And so that's always a consideration as we're looking at the cloud. It's like, how do we make this accessible to the user and easier to do their work? And then lastly, we're considering regulatory requirements. So a lot of these, and HIPAA's a good example, right? So HIPAA wants you to have encryption on your data whenever you're storing medical records. So this is one for the healthcare industry. And so all of those records need to be stored in a state where there's encryption on it. And when they move around from place to place, there has to be encryption in transit and while they're being stored as well. And so as we're looking at that, if we're building cloud for some cloud solution for somebody who needs HIPAA compliance, we just make sure that the cloud solutions we have that encryption built into them. And the majority do at this point, or at a minimum, they have a button you can press to turn on that feature within the cloud apps. But it's important to understand what we're trying to adhere to from a security standpoint as we're selecting cloud solutions so that we make sure that they do have the functionality we need to secure that data and that they're set up, configured, and controlled correctly from there on. So that's another thing that we typically will look at when we're looking at these workloads. So take a quick sip of water. So quick example, right? So say we have a construction company with 80 employees. And they currently have an on-premise server with a couple virtual machines running on it. There's several applications that they run on that server. One is estimating design software that has some 3D design elements in it. They have QuickBooks for their accounting department that's on there. And then they have a PDF manipulation software, Bluebeam or Adobe, something like that, right? They also have files that are stored on their server. Their files are accessed by superintendents, typically on an iPad. So these guys are on a construction site and they're essentially blowing up plans and they're looking at plans for the building that they're building to understand what they need to do on a particular day. These guys already have Office 365, so their email has been moved to Office 365 already. And their goal is to get rid of all the servers in their office so they don't have to maintain any physical server equipment in their office any longer. And so we approach this kind of how we're just talking about, right? So we're going to talk through some of the things here. Some of the challenges we have with moving for these guys. There's no web-based versions of the estimating software that they use. So we can't just get it in a browser, which means that we're going to need to host this server somewhere else. So if we're moving it from the on-premise, then something like Azure may be the best fit to be able to host this since there's not a web-based version of this app. The estimating app, to make things a little more complex, it also references files on the server. So it's looking for the file server and pulling data from there as part of the when you're using that application. If we move the files to a new location from where it's currently pointed on the server, it breaks the app. Then it won't pull up. Okay, we need to figure out a solution for that. And then they also want to make sure that these files are easily accessible for superintendents in the field. So currently their superintendents had been hitting a VPN and then remoting, or essentially using that to connect back to browse files on the server. We want to make that easier for those guys so they can get to those in an easier way. So what do you do for those guys? The estimating software, because there's not a web-based version of that app, it needs to live on a full server somewhere. And so we essentially move the hosting for that to Azure, right? So that workload gets moved to Azure and the accounting software also gets moved to Azure since we have workload there already. And we use published applications for user access. And what a published app is essentially where we put that application on the hosted server and we set it up in such a way that it's essentially publishing those applications for users as if they were local on the network there. And what that means is that as you're accessing that app, you look on your desktop, you click on the app just like you always did. There's no difference in user behavior from what it was when it was on premise. And the app opens and runs as if it was local, but in the back behind the scenes, it's actually running on that hosted server instead of running on your local machine. So that's how one of the ways that we help these guys to not really change their user's workflow very much, right? They're used to opening that up. It would connect to the server there locally. As far as the users are concerned, it looks like they're doing the very same thing that they always have. And so there's no learning curve or anything else that they have to worry about. And we get to move those servers out of their offices into this data center with all the added redundancy, benefits, security that are there. Data gets moved to SharePoint. All of the files that they need for the buildings that they're constructed get moved up to SharePoint. What happens when we do that is now it's going to break their estimating app that references those files. And so we have to make a new connection between their estimating app and SharePoint, where it's repointed to the right location for that data. And in this case, that's something we're able to do for this client. With the big advantages to SharePoint being that it's easily accessible, we have security on it, we can manage those permissions, and even better, the superintendents can now simply hit the SharePoint app on their iPad and use that to browse all the files that they need for their jobs. So it makes their access easier than it ever has been. And simplifies some of the workflows for these guys as well as they're moving data around, working on different projects, different sites. That's an example of kind of the discussion, the thought process, and eventual solution that we would run through for a client as we're determining what the best kind of cloud solutions are. And then how does this break down from a cost comparison standpoint? In this particular case, server, hardware, software, labor costs for basic on-premise server to support a couple of different applications and files, you're probably going to spend maybe 15 grand for that project. If you're keeping that server on site. And then monthly maintenance, support, and backup security for that on-premise server, you're going to pay another 500 bucks a month roughly. And so your total cost over 5 years, you're spending about 45 grand to support that workload. The comparison in the cloud. So we do a cloud migration project. I spent a little over $10,000 for that project. Monthly cost for Azure and hosted servers, about 400 in this case. And then support backup security on that hosted server, a couple hundred bucks a month. Total cost for the cloud over a 5-year span, 46,500. We're very close. This can depend a lot on the particular workload that you're talking about. But a lot of times, I don't know, I think when cloud first came out, it was touted as a huge cost saving thing. For some people, it can be. And the larger scale you have as far as the number of servers you're putting in the cloud and the usage on those servers, depending on the usage of those servers, it can save you a bunch of money. One of the things to keep in mind is that cloud is typically paid by usage. It's almost a utility basis. So you pay for how many cores, what the connectivity is, how much bandwidth you're using, and it's a line item bill for all these things based on how much you're actually using. So if your usage varies significantly from peak to non-peak, cloud can save you a ton of money. A lot of the small businesses we have, the usage really doesn't vary that much. It's in use or not in use as much, right? You work 8 to 5 and then it's mostly idle overnight. But so we find that depending on the workload, it can save you money. For most of our clients, it's going to be pretty close to a break even. Now, because it's a break even, doesn't mean it's not necessarily worth doing. Because remember, cloud and on-premise service are not equal solutions, right? So with the cloud, you get redundant power, redundant internet. We have extra security. We have biometric security at the data center. We have earthquake proof. We have all of these things. And in your office, you have a locked closet door. And so cloud is superior in almost every way, as far as a reliability standpoint, a security standpoint. The data centers these are stored in have a lot more sophisticated firewalls and security on them than most businesses will typically keep for their on-premise servers. And so there's a ton of advantages to cloud. And so for my money, if you're paying close to the same or even a little bit more, cloud is still a better value because of all of those other benefits that you get for your business. So for us, it makes a lot of sense. It's worth looking at the numbers on like we did just here. So will the cloud save us money? Maybe. We'll talk through this. Really depends on those specific workloads. If you're moving to a public cloud solution like Azure, one of the nice things that there is available for us is we can actually go to Azure and they have a calculator application that will essentially track the usage on your on-prem server and say, hey, how much is it using over time? To then estimate in an accurate way what the cost would be if you guys move to the cloud. Because it's usage based, it's sometimes hard to predict. And so a calculator like that is super useful in accurately estimating your real cloud costs. So that's something I would definitely look at before you make the move. Most of our clients we found pretty close to a break even, maybe save a little money depending on their workload. But all right, so if it's break even or close to it, why do we move? Security, redundancy, uptime, accessibility, scalability, ease of use, all important functions of the cloud, something I think are pretty important for us here. So when we're determining what's right for us in the cloud, we want to look at security. Is it the right fit? Can we move to it without issue? What's the right option for us? And can I get rid of my server? For most businesses at this point, you're going to have advantages in almost all of these categories by making a move. Again, we'll take a look with you on your specific workload and make sure that it's the right move for your particular business. But most businesses can make this move, and it's in most cases going to be a good one for them. And the majority of folks can also get rid of their servers in their office if that's what they want to do. So,
Hey, Mike.
yeah.
We have a question from Steve. What about latency issues with cloud-based versus on-prem?
Yeah, so with kind of the rise of the cloud, we've seen a ton of advances in internet too. And so typically when your data is in the cloud, it's going to be in a data center with redundant gigabit or 10 gigabit internet connections running into that data center. So if there is latency issues, it's almost always on the client side, is what we see. And so what we take a look at is, hey, do you have a decent internet connection at your office that you're connecting from to that data center where that cloud solution is going to be? And that's the key factor that we find. So as long as you have a decent internet connection, and it doesn't even have to be amazing to not have latency issues, but that's a great question. I would say most of our clients at this point are on some kind of fiber internet, and anything that has, I guess it depends on what particular solution you're putting in the cloud, but if you have, I don't know, 100 megs of internet, unless you have like hundreds of users on that one internet connection outbound, you're going to be in a really good place. You don't actually need that much bandwidth to be able to successfully connect to the cloud without latency issues. It's something that we look at for every business. The other thing that we used to see was if you have a database backend that you guys work on or connect to, that would sometimes have problems over a VPN back in the day. And a lot of that has been resolved with the additional bandwidth and some other advances that we've had with the technology. Great question, but I would say for the majority of folks, if you have a decent internet connection, that's not going to be a big concern at this point. And yeah, so I would say most businesses should and are leveraging the cloud. So go into it with eyes wide open, look for the solutions that best fit your business needs. i.t.NOW can help take a look with you to determine the best solution, both for functionality and cost. And typically, we're going to look at cost for a cloud over a 3 to 5 year span. and just make sure that it's a fit for what you guys are wanting to do. That was really it, guys. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take those. We'll give you guys just a minute here, but we appreciate you coming. We're glad that you're here. If you guys have questions about your specific setup, or you want to have a further conversation about how to get to the cloud for your business or your options, then if you're clients of i.t.NOW, you're welcome to reach out to your account manager or myself, and we can get that conversation started. And if you're not clients and you want to talk about it, then give me a call, and I'm happy to discuss the needs and understand. And we'll walk through a similar conversation and just get really specific about your business, your needs, what kind of data you have, your applications, how you're connecting, to make sure that we're helping you pick the right solutions that'll be the best fit for your business.
Hey, Mike, so typically, if you're looking at cloud and on-prem,
Yeah.
the cost that you will pay, so financing wise, the upfront cost appears to be a lot less when you go on cloud than it is on-prem, right?
Yeah, typically you do save on upfront costs because you're not buying hardware, right? So a lot of times we don't have to buy hardware. If we're doing a solution like Azure, you're not investing in licensing either. It comes packaged as part of the monthly fee that you pay for the hosted servers. So in the vast majority of cases, if you're making a move to the cloud versus on-prem, or even on-prem server to on-prem server, say you just had an old server that you're looking to replace with another new piece of hardware, the cost of that hardware, software, setup, and everything else is usually significantly more than what you would pay for a migration to cloud at this point.
Okay, cool. I don't see any other questions in the chat box. So I guess that's it. Thank you very much, Mike. That was very revealing.
Yeah. Guys, thanks so much for being here. Appreciate y'all. Have a wonderful rest of your week, and we'll catch you next time.